The spring of 1875 had bled the color from the New Mexico territory, leaving it a study in shades of ochre, rust, and bone. The sun was a merciless hammer in a sky so vast and empty, it seemed to swallow the thin ribbon of iron track whole. On that track, a train rattled its way eastward, a chuffing, groaning creature of steam and steel, kicking up a trailing cloud of red dust that hung in the still air long after it passed. It was not a passenger train of plush velvet seats and polished brass, but a working artery, carrying freight, mail, and the few souls tough enough or desperate enough to be crossing this unforgiving expanse. The last car was for baggage and overflow. A hollow wooden box on wheels that smelled of sun-baked pine, old rope, and the lingering scent of livestock. Light cut through the grime on the windows in dusty, slanted bars, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the rails was a constant, hypnotic beat, the only heartbeat in a world that felt otherwise dead and forgotten. In this forgotten space, a man sat alone. He was a piece of the landscape himself, as weathered and unmoving as the mesas that dotted the horizon. His name was Carter Holt, though he rarely had occasion to use it. He was tall, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, filling the corner he occupied. A worn duster of cracked, oiled leather fell from his shoulders to his scuffed boots, a garment that was less a piece of clothing and more a second skin. Scarred by rain and sun and time, his hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that gave nothing away. His hands, calloused and capable, rested on his knees, still and patient. He watched the world slide by through the open doorway of the car. His eyes narrowed against the glare, their color a cool, distant gray, like a sky before a storm. The silence around him was not empty. It was a presence, a wall he had built and carried with him. The spell of his solitude was broken by a frantic, stumbling sound. A girl appeared in the doorway connecting to the next car, her form silhouetted for a moment against the brighter light before she plunged into the relative dimness. She was young, perhaps 18, with a cascade of dark hair that had come loose from its pins, framing a face pale with terror. Her dress, a simple calico of faded blue, was torn at the hem and stained with the ever-present red dust. She pressed herself back against the rough wall of the car as if trying to melt into the wood, her chest heaving with ragged, desperate breaths. Her eyes wide and the color of dark honey, darted around the empty space, scanning every shadow, every crate, before they landed on him. For a long moment, she just stared. He did not move, did not acknowledge her presence beyond a slow, almost imperceptible shift of his gaze in her direction. In her panic, she saw not a man, but an obstacle, another potential threat in a world that had become nothing but the men behind her were a known danger, a certainty of pain and ruin. This man was an unknown, and in the unknown, there was a sliver of hope. He watched as she pushed off the wall. Her movements were stiff with fear, a small animal cornered and looking for any escape. She clutched a tiny, cloth-wrapped bundle to her chest, her knuckles white. She took a step toward him, then another. The floorboards groaned under her slight weight, the sound loud in the cavernous space. When she was a few feet away, she stopped, her lips parted, but no sound came out. She swallowed, the motion visible in her slender throat, and tried again. The words were a wisp of sound, a dry, trembling whisper that was nearly lost in the clatter of the wheels. "Please," she breathed. "The word a prayer. Sir, please." Carter Holt remained silent. His expression did not change. He simply waited, his stillness a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. He was a rock in the middle of a rushing river, and she was about to be swept away. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him, trying to make him understand the terror that was chasing her down this iron road. "They're in the next car. I heard them." She took another shaky step closer, her desperation overriding her fear of him. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." She looked down at the voluminous leather duster that covered him like a shroud. It was an absurd idea, a child's notion of hiding, but it was the only idea she had left. "Can I—" she started, her voice cracking. "Your coat. Can I hide, just for a moment, please, sir?" He did not ask who they were. He did not ask what she had done, or what they wanted from her. Questions were a currency of time and trust, and he could see in her haunted eyes that she had none of either to spare. He saw the tear in her dress. He saw the tremor in her hands. He saw the raw, animal fear of the hunted. And in his world, you didn't ask questions when a rabbit bolted for cover. Slowly, deliberately, Carter Holt lifted his left arm. With his right hand, he took the dusty edge of his duster and lifted it, creating a small, dark opening, a cave of worn leather and shadow. It was not a gesture of warmth or welcome. It was a simple, practical act, an offer of sanctuary without promise or judgment. He didn't speak a word. His eyes, fixed on her face, were the only invitation she would get. A sob of relief caught in her throat. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled forward on her knees and slipped into the space he had made, burrowing into the darkness. The duster fell back into place, cloaking her completely. Her world shrank to a cramped, warm space that smelled of leather, trail dust, horse, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. She curled into a tight ball, her cheek pressed against the rough denim of his thigh, her hands covering her head, the rhythmic thunder of his heartbeat, slow and steady through the fabric of his clothes, was a strange and solid comfort against the frantic drumming in her own ears. Outside, she was a girl running for her life, inside this small, dark shelter. She was just a breath, a tremor, a silent plea. She had been hidden for no more than a minute when new sounds pierced the train's clatter, the heavy, confident tread of 2 pairs of men's boots, punctuated by the soft jingle of spurs. They were coming from the passenger car, their steps echoing on the connecting plate before striking the wooden floor of the baggage car. Mary squeezed her eyes shut, her breath held tight in her lungs. She could feel Carter's leg muscles tense slightly beneath her cheek, the only sign that he was aware of the approaching threat. A hulking shadow fell across the open doorway, blocking the afternoon sun. "Well now, what have we here?" a voice boomed, thick with false congeniality. Just a lone rider enjoying the view. Mary recognized the voice. It belonged to a man named Silas, the saloon owner's enforcer. It was a voice that had haunted her sleep for weeks, a voice that promised consequences she could not bear to imagine. "Seen a girl pass through here?" "Friend," the voice continued. "About so high, dark hair, looks like a scared little bird that's flown its cage. Got something that belongs to my employer." Carter did not move. He did not turn his head. He continued to gaze out at the passing blur of desert scrub and distant, heat-hazed mountains. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "I'm talking to you." Silas's partner, a thinner, reedier man, snapped with impatience. Slowly, as if rousing from a long slumber. Carter Holt shifted. Mary felt the movement, a subtle ripple of muscle. He turned his head just enough so that his face was no longer in complete shadow. His gray eyes, cold and flat as river stones, lifted to meet the intruders. He did not look at their faces. He looked directly into their eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear. There was nothing at all. It was the unnerving emptiness of his expression that was so disarming. It was the look of a man for whom violence was not a threat or a thrill, but simply a tool, like a hammer or a rope, to be used when necessary and then put away. It was a look that said, without a single word, that this car, this small patch of dusty floorboards, was his, and their presence in it was a trespass he was calmly considering how to end. Silas hesitated. He was a big man, used to intimidating people with his size and his sneer. He had a pistol on his hip and his partner beside him, but he saw the way the cowboy sat, perfectly balanced, utterly still. He saw the man's hands, which hadn't moved from his knees but looked as if they could move with blurring speed. Most of all, he saw those eyes, and he recognized something in them that gave him pause. It was the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and was not afraid to demonstrate it. This was not some farmhand to be bullied. This was trouble of a kind that didn't wash away with whiskey. "Forget it, Silas," the other man muttered, shifting his weight nervously. "She ain't here. Probably jumped off a mile back." Silas grunted, his bravado deflating under the weight of Carter's silent stare. He took a long look around the car at the stacked crates, the coiled ropes, the empty corners. His eyes passed over Carter's seated form, the bulky duster a shapeless mass in the dim light. It never occurred to him to look closer. The sheer audacity of hiding a person in plain sight was beyond his imagination. "Useless," Silas spat. Not at Carter, but at the situation, at the girl who had caused him this trouble. He cast one last, venomous look at the silent cowboy. "If you see her, there's a reward." Carter gave no sign that he had heard. He had already dismissed them, his attention returning to the endless, sun-bleached landscape outside. Frustrated, Silas turned and stomped out of the car, his partner scurrying behind him. Their footsteps receded, disappearing once more into the rhythmic, metallic song of the train. The shadow in the doorway was gone, and the sunlight streamed in again, warm and unfiltered. Still, Carter did not move. He did not speak. He offered no sign that the danger had passed. He simply sat, a silent guardian, a statue of leather and denim. He let the steady rhythm of the wheels carry them further and further away from the threat, putting miles of rattling steel and open desert between the girl huddled beneath his coat and the men who were hunting her. Mary stayed frozen in her hiding place, listening. She listened to the fading footsteps. She listened to the clatter of the train. Most of all, she listened to the slow, even beat of the stranger's heart against her ear. It was the sound of safety, a sound she thought she might never hear again. The terror that had been a physical weight on her chest for days began to recede, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it was a struggle to remain conscious. She did not know the name of the man who shielded her. She did not know why he had helped her. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, she was not alone, and in the warm, dusty darkness beneath a stranger's coat, Mary finally allowed herself to breathe. The sun bled out of the sky, dragging long, skeletal shadows across the desert floor. The world outside the rattling boxcar turned from scorched orange to a deep, bruised purple. A few pale stars began to prick the velvet darkness. Inside, the dimness had become an almost total blackness, broken only by the milky wash of moonlight through the open door. For what felt like an eternity, Mary had remained in her cocoon of leather, listening to the steady rhythm of the train and the even steadier beat of Carter Holt's heart. The exhaustion had settled deep in her bones, a heavy, leaden thing that promised a sleep she hadn't known in weeks. But sleep would not come. A knot of unease was tightening in her stomach. The train had slowed several times, stopping at desolate water towers or lonely depots where nothing but a telegraph pole stood sentinel against the vast emptiness. At each stop, her fear would spike anew. Had they gotten off? Were they waiting for her up ahead? Carter had not moved, had not spoken a single word since the confrontation. He was a figure carved from granite, his stillness absolute. Mary began to wonder if he had forgotten she was there. A small, terrified creature huddled at his feet. But then she would feel the subtle shift of his weight as the train lurched, a minute adjustment that seemed to keep her sheltered. And she knew he had not forgotten. The clatter of the wheels changed its tune, slowing to a grinding groan. Another stop. This one felt different. There were faint shouts from up the line, the hiss of steam being released. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear footsteps again, heavier this time, more of them. They weren't the casual steps of railroad men. They were the purposeful, angry strides of hunters who had realized their prey was still close. Suddenly, Carter's entire body went rigid. It was not a tense fear, but the coiled stillness of a predator about to strike. Mary felt it instantly, a current of silent alarm that shot through her. Through the thick leather of the duster, she heard a voice, sharp and close. Silas's voice. "Check every car again, all of them. She's on this train. I can feel it. And that damn cowboy. Search him this time. Properly." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Mary by the throat. It was over. They would find her. The momentary safety she had found was just a cruel illusion. She began to tremble uncontrollably, a tremor that shook her whole body. She felt a hand, large and calloused, pressed down firmly on her shoulder through the coat. It was not a comforting gesture. It was a command. Be still. Then, everything happened with a speed that stole her breath. Carter rose in one fluid, silent motion, bringing her up with him as if she weighed nothing. One of his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The duster fell away, and the cold night air was a shock against her heated skin. Her eyes, wide and unaccustomed to the dark, struggled to make sense of the scene. Carter was already moving, not toward the connecting door where the footsteps were growing louder, but toward the wide-open maw of the baggage car's side door. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. His face was a mask of intense concentration, his gray eyes fixed on the blur of the moonlit landscape rushing past. He was judging the speed, the terrain, the risk. The shouts from the next car were closer now. The door was about to burst open. "Hold on," he growled, the first words he had spoken to her. His voice was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together. He didn't give her time to think, to protest, to be afraid. His arm tightened like an iron band around her, and he took 2 long strides toward the opening. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, they were airborne, suspended in the cold night between the rocking train and the unforgiving earth. Then gravity took hold, and they fell. The landing was a brutal collision of flesh and rock. They hit the downward slope of the railway embankment, a treacherous surface of loose gravel and sharp stones. Carter took the brunt of the impact, his body twisting to shield hers. They tumbled, a chaotic mess of limbs and flying dust, the world a spinning vortex of dark shapes and jarring pain. Mary cried out as her shoulders slammed into the ground and a sharp rock tore through the fabric of her dress, slicing into the skin of her knee. The air was knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. They came to a halt in a cloud of red dust at the bottom of the slope, a tangle of bodies in the pale moonlight. For a moment, Mary could only lie there, stunned, every inch of her body screaming in protest. The train was already receding, its rhythmic clatter a mocking farewell, its red tail light shrinking to a pinprick in the vast darkness. The silence that rushed in to replace it was absolute, broken only by her own ragged, painful breathing. "Get up!" The command was harsh, urgent. Carter was already disentangling himself from her, rising to his feet with a groan of his own. A dark stain was spreading on the sleeve of his shirt, but he paid it no mind. He grabbed her arm and pulled her upright. Her legs buckled, a fresh wave of pain from her knee making her cry out again. "We have to move, now," he insisted, his grip unforgiving. He didn't offer sympathy. There was no time for it. He scanned the darkness, his head turning, listening. Far off, back along the tracks, she could hear faint, angry shouts. They had been seen, and so began the desperate flight through the New Mexico night. Carter set a punishing pace, half dragging her behind him. He moved with a purpose and a knowledge of the land that was instinctual. The moon, a cold silver disk, was their only guide, casting the landscape in stark relief of black and white. The desert, which had looked flat and empty from the train, was a treacherous maze of unseen gullies, thorny brush and ankle-twisting rocks. Mary stumbled, her city shoes no match for the terrain. The thorns of catclaw acacia tore at her dress and skin, leaving a trail of fiery scratches. The larger, more menacing shapes of saguaro and prickly pear cacti loomed like silent, armed sentinels in the dark. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. Her lungs burned, a stitch of fire searing her side. The pain in her knee was a constant, throbbing agony. She wanted to stop, to collapse, to give up, but the iron grip on her arm never slackened. Carter was a relentless engine, pulling her forward, his will her only source of momentum. Once, she tripped and fell hard, the impact jarring her teeth. A sob of despair and pain escaped her lips. "I can't," she gasped, the words choked with dust and tears. "I can't go on." He stopped, turning to loom over her. For a moment, she thought he would leave her, but instead, he knelt. The moonlight caught his face, and for the first time, she saw his expression clearly. The cold indifference was gone. In its place was a look of fierce, focused intensity. His eyes weren't looking at her, but through her, past her, scanning the darkness behind them, assessing the threat. It was the look of a wolf defending its territory, a hawk protecting its nest. It was the look of a protector. He didn't speak. He simply ripped a strip of cloth from the hem of his own shirt, the sound loud in the stillness. He knelt and, with surprising gentleness, wrapped it tightly around her bleeding knee, his rough fingers brushing her skin. The makeshift bandage provided little comfort for the pain, but the act itself was a revelation. He then stood, pulling her to her feet once more. "You can," he said, his voice low and certain, and because of the look in his eyes, because of the unexpected touch of his hands, she believed him. They continued on, pushing deeper into the wilderness. After another hour of grueling travel, Carter led them into a shallow canyon, the rock walls rising on either side and muffling the sound of their footsteps. He stopped beside a thicket of dry greasewood. From a pouch on his belt, he produced a flint and steel. With swift, practiced motions, he struck a spark into a small bundle of tinder. A tiny flame flickered to life. He carefully fed it with dry twigs until a small but vigorous fire was burning. Then he began piling on green branches from the greasewood bushes. Thick, acrid smoke began to billow upwards, a dense white plume against the dark sky. "They'll be tracking us by horse," he explained, his voice still a low rasp. "They'll see the smoke and think we've stopped to make camp. It'll draw them east. We go north." He kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing the flames but leaving the green wood to smolder and smoke. He had bought them time. He had given them a chance. Their path now led up the steep, rocky side of the canyon. It was more of a climb than a walk. Carter went first, finding handholds and footholds in the crumbling rock face, his arm reaching back to haul her up after him. At the top, they paused, crouched behind a cluster of boulders, catching their breath. Below, in the distance, they could see the faint, flickering lights of lanterns moving toward the plume of smoke. The ruse had worked, but they were not safe yet. He pushed them onward, across a high mesa where the wind blew cold and lonely. It was here, as they were scrambling over a jumble of ancient, weathered rocks, that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of shod hooves on stone. It was a small party, perhaps 2 riders, who hadn't fallen for the trick. They were close, dangerously close. Carter's reaction was instantaneous. He shoved her down behind a massive slab of sandstone that had split away from the main formation, creating a deep, narrow crevice. He squeezed in beside her, pulling her back into the deepest part of the shadow. The space was incredibly tight. Her back was pressed against the cold, rough rock, and his chest was a solid wall against hers. One of his arms was around her, holding her in place, while his other hand came up to cover her mouth. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and their shared fear. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against his ribs. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his own heart against her cheek. They were so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her hair. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the low murmur of men's voices, carried on the wind. Saw them cross here? The tracks are fresh. It was Silas's voice. They can't have gone far on foot, the other man replied. Spread out. Fire a shot if you see anything. The sounds were almost directly overhead. A small cascade of pebbles and dust, dislodged by a horse's hoof, trickled down the rock face and landed on Carter's hat. Mary's entire body went rigid with terror. She wanted to scream, but the firm, unyielding pressure of Carter's hand over her mouth kept her silent. He held her fast, his body a living shield, absorbing her tremors, willing her to be as still and silent as the ancient stone that surrounded them. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the pounding of her own blood in her ears. The riders passed. The hoofbeats began to fade, moving away across the mesa. They waited. 1 minute, 5, 10. They waited in absolute silence until the only sound was the sigh of the wind and their own quiet breathing. Slowly, Carter removed his hand from her mouth. His arm, however, remained securely around her, holding her in the protective darkness of the crevice. He didn't let go. She was shaking, a delayed reaction of terror and exhaustion shuddering through her. In the cramped darkness, pressed against the solid warmth of this stranger, a single, overwhelming thought surfaced through the fog of her fear and pain. It was a thought that was both a surprise and a profound truth, a realization that bloomed in the heart of the desolate wilderness. I have never been held so tightly by anyone. It was true. She had been grabbed, pushed, and handled like a possession. She had been bartered and sold, but she had never been held. Not like this. Not with a strength that was meant not to control, but to protect. Not with a closeness that felt less like an invasion and more like a fortress. In that moment, Carter Holt was not a cold stranger. He was an anchor in a storm, a rock in a flood, and for the first time she felt the fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope that perhaps she might survive the night. They walked for what remained of the night, a silent procession of two against the immense, star-dusted canvas of the sky. The urgency of the chase had faded, replaced by a slow, trudging exhaustion that was a pain all its own. Carter no longer pulled her, but walked beside her, his presence a steady, dark shape in her peripheral vision. He moved with an unhurried, ground-covering stride that spoke of a deep familiarity with this world, of knowing how to conserve strength when the finish line was still unseen. Mary followed on pure instinct, her mind a numb landscape of pain and weariness. Each step sent a jolt of fire up from her knee, her arms and face stung from a dozen cuts and scratches. But a strange, fragile trust had taken root in the ruins of her terror. This man, this silent stranger, had thrown them from a train and led her on a desperate flight through the dark. And yet, she had never felt safer. She was following him into the unknown, but it was an unknown of his choosing, and that felt infinitely better than the one she had been running from. Just as the eastern horizon began to soften from charcoal to a pale, bruised gray, the terrain began to change. Carter led her down a winding, narrow path that seemed to be little more than a game trail, descending from the high mesa into the deep shadows between two looming, red rock formations. The air grew stiller, the wind that had scoured the flats above unable to reach this sheltered place. As the first true rays of sunlight speared over the canyon rim, they illuminated their destination. It was not a grand ranch, not a sprawling homestead. It was a small, stubborn pocket of life carved out of the wilderness, nestled in a valley so well hidden it felt like a secret. A low-slung cabin of dark, weathered timber sat at its heart, a plume of wood smoke rising from its stone chimney in a thin, lazy curl. A small corral, its fence posts leaning at weary angles, held two sturdy-looking horses. A few chickens pecked and scratched in the dust near a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. A rusty iron bell hung from a post, its rope frayed and bleached by the sun. It was a place built not for show, but for survival. It was worn, tired, and imperfect, and to Mary's exhausted eyes, it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. As they drew closer, The cabin door creaked open. Mary's breath caught in her throat, a reflexive spike of fear. Had he led her into another trap? But it was not a man who emerged. It was a boy, no older than 6 or 7, a shock of sandy hair sticking up in all directions. He was small for his age, dressed in a pair of denim trousers held up by a single suspender over a shirt that was several sizes too big. He stood on the porch, rubbing the sleep from his eyes with a small fist, his expression one of sober curiosity. The boy's eyes found Carter, and a slow, quiet smile spread across his face. He didn't shout or run. He simply walked to the edge of the porch and waited. "You're back," he said, his voice clear in the still morning air. It wasn't a question, but a statement of relief. Carter stopped a few feet from the steps, the weariness of the night showing in the slump of his shoulders. He gave the boy a single, slow nod. "Sam," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. The boy, Sam, finally turned his bright, inquisitive gaze on Mary. He took in her torn dress, her disheveled hair, the streaks of dirt and dried blood on her face. He saw the makeshift bandage on her knee. There was no judgment in his look, only a child's open, unfiltered curiosity. He looked back at Carter, his unspoken question hanging in the air between them. Carter offered no explanation. He simply placed a hand on the boy's head for a brief moment as he stepped onto the porch, a gesture of silent reassurance that seemed to satisfy the child completely. Carter held the door open for Mary. She hesitated for a second before climbing the steps, the movement sending a fresh protest of pain through her leg. She stepped past him into the cabin's dim interior. The inside was one main room, as simple and rugged as the exterior. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of coffee bubbling gently on the hearth. A sturdy table of rough-hewn plank wood stood in the center, flanked by 2 benches. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and bacon. It was the scent of a home. Against the far wall, a small area was curtained off with a thick wool blanket. "Water's in the bucket," Carter said, gesturing with his head toward a pail and a tin basin on a small stand. "There's a clean cloth there. See to your cuts." He pointed to the curtained alcove. "You can rest there. No one will bother you." Mary could only nod, her throat too tight with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion to form words. She limped to the basin, the cool water a balm on her stinging skin. As she carefully cleaned the grime from her face and arms, she watched him from the corner of her eye. He moved to the fireplace and poured 2 mugs of coffee, placing one on the table. Sam had pulled himself onto one of the benches and was watching her with unabashed interest, swinging his legs back and forth. She finished tending to her wounds as best she could and turned toward the cot he had indicated. It was just a simple frame with a straw-stuffed mattress and a pair of worn blankets, but it looked like the finest feather bed in the world. She was about to pull the curtain closed when Carter spoke again. She looked back at him. He was standing near the center of the room, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space. He had taken off his hat, and in the soft light from the single window, she could see the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. He looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze held something other than detached assessment or focused intensity. It held a kind of finality, the weight of a vow. "Sleep safe tonight," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. "No one will take you again." The words were not gentle or soft. They were hard, solid things, like stones laid for a foundation. They were a promise, delivered with the unshakable certainty of a man who did not make promises lightly. A dam inside Mary that had been holding back months of fear and despair finally broke. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She ducked behind the curtain before he could see any more, a choked sob catching in her throat. She sank onto the cot, the straw rustling beneath her, and listened as he and the boy began to move about the cabin, their quiet sounds a lullaby of safety. She pulled a thin blanket over her and, for the first time since she'd fled her father's house, she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. She awoke to the gentle warmth of the mid-morning sun on her face. Light streamed through a small crack in the cabin's timber wall, creating a bright stripe across the blankets. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, disoriented. The air was quiet, the cabin empty. She could hear the cluck of chickens outside, the distant nicker of a horse, the soft sigh of the wind through the valley. They were peaceful sounds, domestic sounds. The frantic terror of the past few days felt like a distant, nightmarish dream. Sitting up, she saw that someone had been in while she slept. Folded neatly at the foot of her cot was a simple dress of dark blue cotton, mended in several places but clean. Beside it sat her small bundle, which she had dropped during the fall from the train. He had gone back for it. The thought was a small, startling ember of warmth in her chest. After changing, she pushed aside the curtain. The cabin was empty. The fire in the hearth banked to a low glow. She felt a sudden, powerful urge to do something, to be useful, to erase the image of the helpless creature who had stumbled in at dawn. She found a worn broom leaning in a corner and stepped outside onto the porch. The valley was bathed in the golden light of morning. It was a starkly beautiful place. The red rock of the canyon walls contrasting with the pale green of the hardy grasses on the valley floor. The world felt quiet and still, safe. She began to sweep the porch, the rhythmic scrape and whisk of the bristles a strangely satisfying sound. It was a simple, ordinary act, and in its ordinariness, it was a balm to her shattered nerves. It was an act of a person who belonged somewhere, even if just for a morning. She was finishing when she saw them. Carter and Sam were walking up from the corral. Carter was carrying a heavy bucket of water in each hand, his stride even and unhurried. Sam trotted alongside him, chattering away, pointing at a lizard that had scurried across their path. Carter listened, offering a quiet murmur now and then, his attention on the boy. Mary stopped sweeping, her hands tightening on the broom handle, feeling like an intruder on this quiet, self-contained world. Carter saw her as he approached. He didn't stop or change his expression, but he gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement before carrying the buckets inside. "A little while later," he called from the doorway. "Food's ready." She followed him inside. The table was set with 3 tin plates. A skillet of sizzling bacon and a stack of thick corn cakes sat in the middle, their aroma filling the room. It was a simple meal, but to Mary, who had been surviving on stolen bread and fear, it was a banquet. She took her seat on the bench opposite Sam, who gave her a shy, gap-toothed smile. Carter sat at the head of the table, before serving himself. He took the skillet and, using his own fork, slid the 2 largest, meatiest strips of bacon and a generous helping of corn cakes onto her plate. He did it without a word, a gesture so simple and yet so profound in its silent offering of care that Mary didn't know what to say. She just murmured a quiet, "Thank you." The meal began in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable one. It was the quiet of people who were accustomed to each other's presence. Then Sam, his mouth full of corn cake, decided to fill the void. "Carter fought a bear yesterday," he announced proudly. Mary looked up, startled, glancing at Carter, who didn't react, continuing to eat his breakfast. "It wasn't a real bear," Sam clarified. Seeing her confusion, it was a cactus bear. It was as big as the whole canyon, and it had spines as long as my arm. It tried to steal our water, but Carter, he lassoed it. He lassoed the whole thing and pulled it right over the mountain. The boy's eyes were wide with the wonder of his own story, his small hands gesturing wildly to illustrate the scale of the mythical battle. A small, unfamiliar feeling bubbled up inside Mary. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was the urge to smile. A genuine, unforced smile bloomed on her face, the first in what felt like a lifetime. The image of this stoic, silent man wrestling a giant cactus was so absurd, so purely a child's invention, that it broke through her wall of sorrow. Carter glanced at her, saw her smile, and the corner of his own mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. She looked around the simple cabin, at the earnest little boy telling his impossible tales, at the quiet, formidable man who had offered her a shield when she had nothing left. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but for the first time, it was joined by something else, a fragile, tentative sprout of peace. She had a full plate in front of her. She had a solid roof over her head. And for one quiet morning, in a hidden valley at the edge of the world, she was safe. The days that followed settled into a quiet, fragile rhythm, as gentle and steady as the desert breathing at dawn. The terror of the chase began to recede, leaving behind the dull, deep ache of memory, like a poorly set bone. Mary found her place in the small, self-contained world of the hidden ranch not through instruction, but through observation. She learned the morning moods of the chickens and the precise amount of scratch to scatter for them. She found a needle and thread in a small wooden box and mended a tear in one of Sam's shirts, her stitches small and neat. She discovered a patch of struggling vegetables behind the cabin parched for water and choked with weeds, and took to tending it, her hands finding a strange comfort in the feel of the cool, dark earth. These small tasks were an anchor. They were her silent way of earning the food she ate, the roof over her head, the safety she had been so freely given. They were a way to fill the long, quiet hours and keep the ghosts of her past at bay. Through this quiet work, she watched the man who had saved her. Carter Holt was a man of ceaseless motion and profound silence. He was up before the sun, his movements sure and economical as he saw to the horses, mended a section of broken corral fence, or chopped firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat in the morning stillness. He worked with a relentless, focused energy, as if he were in a constant, silent battle with the entropy of the wilderness, and was determined to win. His interactions with Sam were the only crack in his stoic facade. He would listen to the boy's endless stream of stories and questions with a quiet patience, sometimes offering a one-word answer or a rare, fleeting smile that was more a softening of his eyes than a movement of his lips. He taught the boy how to tie a proper knot, how to check a horse's hoof for stones, his large, calloused hands guiding Sam's small ones with a surprising gentleness. In these moments, Mary saw not a hardened cowboy, but a guardian, a silent and unwavering protector. The past, however, was a patient predator. It waited in the quiet moments, in the deep shadows of the evening after Sam had been put to bed on his small pallet by the hearth. It was in one of these silences, on the third night of her stay, that it finally cornered her. The day's chores were done. A simple dinner of beans and cornbread had been eaten. Sam was asleep, his breathing soft and even. The only light in the cabin came from the warm, flickering glow of the fire, which cast long, dancing shadows on the timber walls. Mary was at the wash basin, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water, scrubbing the tin plates from their meal. Carter sat at the table behind her, mending a piece of leather tack, his head bent over his work, his hands moving with practiced skill. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft splash of water. It was in this quiet intimacy that the words she had kept locked away began to press against her throat. She had given him nothing, not even her story, in exchange for her life. The debt of that felt heavy, and she knew, with a sudden certainty, that she could not bear it alone any longer. "My father," she began, her voice small and tight, a foreign sound in the quiet room. Carter's hand stilled for a fraction of a second over the leather, the only indication that he had heard her. He did not look up. He did not speak. He simply waited, giving her the space to continue. "He was a good man, once," she said, staring down at her hands in the murky water, before the drink took hold of him. "After my mother passed, he started losing pieces of himself. First his pride, then his work, then his memory." She paused, swallowing against the familiar lump of grief. "Then he started losing money. More than we had, more than we could ever have. She took a plate from the water and placed it on the draining board, her movements stiff and jerky. "There's a man in the town of Redemption. His name is Alistair Finch. He owns the saloon, the hotel. He owns most everything. My father owed him a great deal. Mr. Finch is not a patient man." She fell silent. The rest of the story a jagged, shameful thing she did not know how to voice. She expected Carter to say something, to ask a question, to prompt her, but he remained silent. His stillness an invitation to continue at her own pace. He had not turned to look at her. He had not moved. He was simply listening. "Mr. Finch came to our house. He told my father the debt was due. He said there was one asset left to collect." The words came out in a choked whisper. "He was talking about me. My father signed a paper, a marriage contract, to settle the debt." She scrubbed at a clean plate with a desperate, furious energy, as if she could scour away the memory itself. I was to be his wife, Mr. Finch's wife. I was property, payment for my father's whiskey and bad luck at cards. Tears were blurring her vision now, hot and shameful. She had not cried when it happened. She had been too numb, too horrified. But here, in this quiet, safe place, the pain was finally real. They were to be married in a week. He gave me a ring. She glanced down at her bare hand, remembering the cold, heavy weight of the gold band. The night before the wedding, I took it, and I took the money from the cash box in the saloon office. Not much, just what I could carry. I thought it was the only payment I could claim for myself, for my life. That's what they're after, Silas and the others. Mr. Finch doesn't care about the money. He cares that his property ran away. He wants the ring back. He wants me back." Her confession ended on a ragged sob. She let the dishcloth fall into the water and pressed her fists to her mouth, shaking with the force of her repressed misery. She stood with her back to him, braced for his reaction. Disgust, perhaps, or worse, pity. She waited for him to get up and walk away, to leave her alone with the ugliness of her story. The scraping sound of the chair on the wooden floor made her flinch. He was leaving, but his footsteps didn't move toward the door. They came closer, stopping right beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply reached past her, his arm brushing hers, and picked up the damp dish towel she had dropped. He took a wet plate from the draining board and began to dry it. Mary stared at him, bewildered. His face was impassive in the firelight, his expression unreadable. But he was there. He hadn't left. He was standing beside her, taking up the simple, domestic task she had abandoned, sharing the small space, sharing the silence. He dried one plate, then another, his movements calm and deliberate. The methodical, unhurried motion was a silent rebuttal to the chaos of her story. He was not judging her. He was not pitying her. He was simply with her. His presence was a solid, undeniable statement. "I heard you. I am still here." He finished the last plate, rinsed out the basin, and carefully folded the damp towel over the edge. He still had not said a word, but as he turned to move back to the table, his hand brushed her arm, a brief, almost accidental touch that sent a shiver of warmth through her. It was an anchor in the storm of her shame, a quiet acknowledgement that was more comforting than 1,000 words of reassurance could ever be. The next afternoon, the air between them felt different. The silence was no longer just an absence of words, but a vessel that held a shared understanding. While Carter was out checking fence lines, Mary sat on the porch with Sam, showing him how to weave a small basket from dried grasses. Sam was unusually quiet for a time, his small brows furrowed in concentration. Then, he pointed to a faint, silvery scar that cut across the back of his own small hand. "Got this before Carter," he said matter-of-factly. Mary looked at him, her fingers stilling on the grass reeds. "Oh, how did that happen?" she asked gently. "Don't remember much?" he said, shrugging his small shoulders. It was cold. I was in a place like that place you ran from. Mary's heart gave a painful lurch. A saloon, she whispered. Sam nodded. An old one, in a town with no people left in it. The door was stuck. I was just there for a long time. Then one day, the door wasn't stuck anymore. What happened? Mary leaned forward, her voice barely audible. Carter came, Sam said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious answer in the world. He looked up at her, his blue eyes wide and honest. He didn't say anything. He just broke the lock. He had water in a canteen and some jerky. He gave it to me, put a blanket around me, and lifted me up onto his horse. We rode all day and all night. He picked up a blade of grass and began to weave it back into his clumsy basket, his small face serious with the memory. He looked at her again and delivered the profound and simple truth that suddenly explained everything about the silent man who had saved them both. He doesn't talk, Sam said. He just does. The boy's words settled over Mary. A moment of perfect, startling clarity. She looked out at the valley, at the distant figure of Carter on his horse. A small, solitary man against the vast, rugged landscape. She finally understood. He was a mender of broken things, a rescuer of the lost. He found souls abandoned in the wreckage of saloons, a little boy locked in an empty one, a young woman sold to another, and he simply acted. He didn't ask for reasons or offer pretty words. He broke the lock. He offered a hand. He stood beside you and dried the dishes. A thin, invisible thread had been slowly weaving itself between them since the moment she had first hidden beneath his coat. But now, she could feel it strengthening. It was a cord spun not from flirtation or promises, but from something far stronger, the shared silence of past hurts, the quiet language of a helping hand, and the profound, unspoken understanding between two people who had been saved by a man who didn't talk, but simply did. The summer settled into the small valley, a season of intense, dry heat and blindingly blue skies. Time, which had once been a frantic race against pursuers, now measured itself in the slow, deliberate arc of the sun. The ranch became Mary's entire world, a sanctuary bounded by red rock and the silent presence of the man who had brought her there. Her fear, once a constant, sharp-edged companion, had softened into a dull, watchful memory, a scar that still pulled tight when she let her thoughts wander too far back along the iron tracks of the railroad. She fell into the rhythm of the place as if she had known it her whole life. The labor was hard, but it was honest, and it left no room for the ghosts that haunted the idle. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused from pulling weeds in the vegetable patch, from scrubbing clothes on a washboard, from kneading dough for the daily cornbread. She found a quiet satisfaction in these tasks, in the tangible results of her effort: a row of thriving squash plants, a neatly mended shirt for Sam, the warm, yeasty smell of bread cooling on the windowsill. She was no longer a piece of property, a debt to be collected. Here, she was a contributor, a necessary part of the small, functioning whole. Her relationship with Carter remained a thing of deep silences and shared spaces. They moved around each other in the small cabin with an unconscious grace, an unspoken understanding of each other's habits and needs. He knew she liked to sit on the porch in the last light of evening, and he would often leave a dipper of cool water on the railing for her before he went to see to the horses. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong, and she made sure the pot was always simmering on the hearth when he came in from his morning chores. These were not courtesies. They were the small, interlocking gears of a life being built together, a life that was still too new and fragile to be given a name. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the relentless sun, Mary took a walk along the shaded creek bed that cut through the far end of the valley. It was the only place where the vegetation grew thick and green. Ferns unfurled in the cool, damp air, and the air hummed with the lazy drone of insects. It was there, nestled amongst the roots of an ancient cottonwood tree, that she sawed a single, delicate wildflower, Its petals were the color of a twilight sky, a deep, velvety purple, and it stood on a stem so slender it seemed a miracle it wasn't broken. In a world of rock, dust, and unrelenting sun, this small splash of color was a defiant act of beauty. It was a whisper of softness in a landscape of hard edges. Without thinking, she knelt and gently plucked it from the earth. She held it in her palm on the walk back to the cabin, its fragility a stark contrast to the calluses on her skin. It was such a small, useless thing. It could not be eaten, or worn, or used to mend a fence. Its only purpose was to be beautiful. That evening, as Carter was outside checking on a horse that had thrown a shoe, Mary acted on a quiet impulse. She took the small purple flower and placed it on the cabin's doorstep. She set it carefully on the most worn part of the timber, a spot where his boot had landed thousands of times, where the wood was smoothed and hollowed by his constant presence. She added no note. She whispered no explanation into the air. The flower was the message. It was a silent thank you for the food, for the shelter, for the unasked-for protection. It was a way of bringing a small piece of beauty into the life of a man who seemed to deal only in the harsh necessities of survival. She went back inside, her heart beating a little faster than usual, and busied herself with stoking the fire. She felt a strange vulnerability, as if she had just laid a small, secret piece of her own soul out in the open. When she heard his footsteps approaching the porch, she held her breath, her back to the door. She heard the familiar creak of the floorboards as he stopped. The silence stretched for a long moment. She imagined him standing there, looking down at the absurdly small offering. She pictured a frown of confusion on his face. He would probably kick it aside, uncomprehending, annoyed by the clutter. Then, she heard the door open and close. She did not turn around. Later, when she thought he was not looking, she stole a glance at the doorstep. The flower was gone. A small, sharp pang of disappointment went through her. He had thrown it away. It had been a foolish, sentimental gesture. But then she noticed that he had not returned to his task of mending the leather tack. He was seated at the table, a small, leather-bound journal open before him. It was a worn, battered thing, its cover stained and its pages filled with what looked like crude, hand-drawn maps and scrawled notes. As she watched from the shadows, she saw him carefully open the book to a clean page. He took the small purple flower and laid it gently on the paper. He closed the book, pressing down on it for a moment with the palm of his hand. A silent, final act. He had not thrown it away. He had saved it. He had preserved her small, useless gift in the pages of his most practical possession. A few days later, Mary found her own quiet offering returned in kind. She had taken to spending the hottest part of the afternoon under the shade of a gnarled juniper tree at the edge of her vegetable garden. It was her private place, a spot where she could sit with her mending and look out over the valley, feeling the soft breeze that always seemed to stir there. One afternoon, as she approached the tree, she saw something new. Tucked into the shaded hollow at the base of the trunk was one of Carter's tin canteens, beaded with cool condensation, and beside it, a neatly folded square of clean, soft cotton cloth. She stopped, her heart giving a little flutter of surprise. He had never seen her rest there. Not that she was aware of, but he must have. He was a man who noticed everything, the slightest change in the wind, the subtle track of a coyote in the dust, the weariness in her posture at the end of a long day. He had seen her routine, anticipated her need for a cool drink and a cloth to wipe the sweat from her brow, and he had provided for it, silently and without expectation of thanks. She knelt and picked up the canteen. The water was cool and fresh, a luxury in the afternoon heat. She held the soft cloth to her cheek. It was a gesture of such profound and simple thoughtfulness that it brought tears to her eyes. It was a silent conversation, a language of care spoken without a single word. He was telling her that he saw her, that her comfort mattered, that this place was her home. 2. As summer bled into autumn, the days remained warm, But the nights grew sharp with a new cold that seeped down from the high peaks. A chill wind began to prowl the valley after sunset, rattling the shutters and finding its way through the small cracks in the cabin's timber walls. The thin curtain that separated Mary's sleeping alcove from the main room offered little protection from the drafts that came through her small, ill-fitting window. She would lie awake at night, curled under her thin blankets, listening to the lonely sound of the wind and the rattling of the wooden shutter, a sound that made her feel vulnerable and exposed. One evening, as she was preparing for bed behind the curtain, she heard a sound just outside her window. She froze, her old fear a cold knot in her stomach, but then she recognized the sound of Carter's boots on the hard-packed earth, peeking through a tiny gap in the curtain. She could see his dark silhouette against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. He was examining her window shutter, testing the loose wooden latch with his thumb. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a length of thick rope. He did not knock. He did not ask if the wind bothered her. He had simply observed a problem and set about fixing it. She watched, mesmerized, as his capable hands worked in the fading light. He looped the rope around the shutter and the window frame, his movements efficient and precise. He pulled it taut, testing the tension, and then tied it off with a series of knots that were both intricate and unshakable. He gave the shutter one final push. It didn't budge. It didn't rattle. It was secure. He stepped back, his head tilted as he surveyed his work. And then, satisfied, he turned and walked away. The sound of the wind was instantly muffled. The persistent, unnerving rattle that had kept her awake was gone. Her small, vulnerable space was now a fortress against the night, lying in the new, profound silence. Mary felt a wave of security so powerful it was almost overwhelming. He had not just fixed a window. He had built her a wall. He had stood guard over her sleep. Love was not a word spoken between them. It was not a grand declaration or a whispered promise in the dark. It was a wild desert flower, pressed between the pages of a map. It was a canteen of cool water, left in a shady spot. It was a length of rope, tied with steady hands to quiet the rattling of a midnight wind. It was a silent covenant being built, one small, practical act of care at a time, each gesture a stone laid in the foundation of something solid, something real, something that neither of them yet dared to name. The peace of the hidden valley was a fragile, precious thing, most keenly felt in the deep quiet of the night. Autumn had laid its claim, and the air after sundown was crisp and cold, smelling of dry earth and wood smoke. Inside the cabin, a low fire crackled in the hearth, its warm light pushing back the shadows. Sam was asleep on his pallet, a small, still mound under a wool blanket. Mary sat at the table, mending one of Carter's shirts by the flickering lamplight, her needle moving in a steady, rhythmic pattern. Carter himself sat on the porch, a silent silhouette against the star-dusted sky, cleaning his rifle. The familiar, metallic click-clack of the mechanism was a strangely comforting sound, a part of the evening's quiet music. It was a piece so profound that its shattering felt like a physical violation. The first sound was wrong. It wasn't the call of a night bird or the rustle of a coyote in the brush. It was the jingle of harness and the thud of shod hooves on hard-packed earth, coming too fast, too loud. Mary's head snapped up, her needle poised in midair. Her heart, which had learned to beat at a slow, steady rhythm, suddenly kicked into a frantic, panicked gallop. She saw Carter's silhouette stiffen, his movements instantly ceasing. He had heard it too. He rose in one fluid motion and slipped back inside the cabin, his face a grim, unreadable mask in the firelight. He didn't need to say anything. The alarm was a living thing in the small room. He moved to the wall where a heavy shotgun rested on two wooden pegs. Then the shouting began, a harsh, brutal sound that tore the quiet night to shreds. "Mary, we know you're in there. You little thief, come on out, or we'll burn this whole place to the ground." It was Silas's voice, the sound of it, a voice she had prayed she would never hear again. sent a wave of ice-cold terror through her. It wasn't a nightmare. They had found her. The sanctuary was broken. "Stay with the boy." Carter's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He checked the load in the shotgun. His movements economical and sure. "Don't open the door for anyone." He moved to the door, his tall frame blocking the way. A human barricade between his small, fragile family and the violence that waited outside. He didn't open the door. He stood beside it, listening. "We've got you cornered. Girl," another voice bellowed. "This one higher-pitched, more nervous. Finch wants what's his. He wants you." The crude words struck Mary with the force of a physical blow. She scrambled to Sam's side, her body instinctively curling around the sleeping child as if to shield him from the filth of their words. Sam stirred, murmuring in his sleep, and her heart ached with a fierce, protective love that was sharper than her own fear. A heavy thud slammed against the door, making the whole cabin shudder. They were trying to break it down. Carter didn't flinch. He simply moved to the center of the room, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. Its twin barrels pointed squarely at the wooden planks that were the only thing separating them from the night. Another crash, and this time a splinter of wood flew inward. The bar holding the door was groaning in protest. "Last chance," Cowboy Silas roared. "Send out the girl and we'll let you live." Carter remained silent, a statue of deadly intent. Mary could see the muscles in his jaw clenching and unclenching. The door would not hold for much longer. He knew it. She knew it. In that moment, he made a decision. He was not a man to be cornered. He would meet the threat on his own terms. He moved to the small, shuttered window beside the door, unlatching it with a flick of his wrist. He peered out into the darkness for a fraction of a second, then turned back to Mary. His gray eyes, hard as flint, found hers. "Stay down," he commanded. Then, he threw the door open and stepped out onto the porch. The shotgun held steady. The sudden flood of moonlight silhouetted him, making him a perfect target. Mary's heart stopped. Outside, 3 figures were arrayed in the yard. Silas stood in the middle, a cruel smirk on his face, a pistol in his hand. He was flanked by 2 other men, both armed with rifles. They had been expecting him to cower. They had not been expecting this silent, immediate confrontation. "Well now," Silas sneered, his confidence returning. "The brave hero. I should have known. Just give us the girl, friend. This ain't your fight." "This is my home," Carter said, his voice level and cold, carrying in the still night air. "You're not welcome here. Leave now." "We ain't leaving without our property," one of the other men snarled, raising his rifle. It happened in a blur. As the man leveled his weapon, Carter fired the shotgun. The blast was a deafening roar that echoed off the canyon walls. It was not aimed at the man, but at the ground just in front of his feet. Dirt and gravel exploded upwards, and the man cried out, stumbling back more in surprise than in pain. The shot was a declaration. It was Carter's final warning. But in that split second, as all eyes were on the man who had been shot at, Silas moved. He didn't charge Carter. He darted to the side, toward the open cabin door. He was going for the boy. He was going for their leverage. Carter saw the movement and reacted instantly. He swung the heavy shotgun around, using it as a club, but he was a fraction of a second too late. As he moved to block the doorway, the third man, who had been circling around, lunged from the shadows of the porch and brought the butt of his pistol down in a vicious, cracking blow against the back of Carter's head. Mary saw it happen. She saw the solid, unshakable man who was her protector falter. His body went slack, the shotgun clattering to the porch floorboards. He crumpled to the ground without a sound, a dark, still heap in the moonlight. A scream, raw and animalistic, tore from Mary's throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The one solid thing in her universe had just been broken. Silas was already in the cabin, his face alight with triumphant cruelty. He saw her kneeling beside Sam and lunged, his dirty hand grabbing a fistful of the boy's shirt. He hauled the child from his pallet. Sam, ripped from sleep into a world of terror, let out a high, thin wail of fear. "Now we've got something to bargain with," Silas snarled, dragging the crying boy back toward the door, holding him like a shield. Something inside Mary snapped. The terror that had paralyzed her for so long was burned away in a sudden, white-hot flash of pure rage. The fear was still there, a cold, trembling thing in the pit of her stomach. But it was now secondary to a new, powerful instinct to protect. They had hurt Carter. They had taken Sam. They had invaded her home, and they would not win. Her eyes fell on the wall, on the 2 wooden pegs where Carter kept his hunting rifle. It was a long, heavy Winchester, a tool she had only ever seen him clean. "Never fire." She scrambled to her feet, her movements clumsy with adrenaline. She pulled the rifle from the wall. The stock was smooth and cool against her cheek, the barrel impossibly heavy. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. She stumbled to the doorway, the rifle in her hands. The scene outside was a tableau of horror. Carter was unmoving on the ground. Silas was backing away, holding a terrified, struggling Sam in front of him. The other 2 men were turning their attention back to her, their faces a mixture of surprise and contempt at the sight of the girl with the gun. "Look at that," one of them laughed. "The little bird's got claws?" Mary's mind was a storm, but one thought was crystal clear. Protect the boy. She raised the rifle, the front sight wavering wildly as she tried to aim. Her finger found the trigger. She didn't think, she just acted. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was even louder than the shotguns, a sharp crack that was brutally intimate next to her ear. The rifle kicked back with a force that slammed into her shoulder, a jarring, painful blow that almost knocked her off her feet. The shot went wild, burying itself in the dirt of the corral fence post, yards away from any of the men. It was a warning shot born of panic, not of purpose. But it made them pause. All 3 of them stared at her, their mocking smiles gone. The girl was not just screaming. The girl was shooting. Silas, however, was not deterred. He tightened his grip on Sam, a cruel grin returning to his face. "You wouldn't dare shoot with the boy in the way," he taunted, taking another step back toward his horse. He was wrong. Seeing Sam's terrified face, hearing his choked sobs, Mary's panic solidified into a diamond-hard point of focus. The trembling in her hands did not stop, but it no longer controlled her. She took a breath, just as she had once seen Carter do before taking a difficult shot at a distant coyote. She let the breath out slowly. She ignored the 2 men with the rifles. She ignored the blood that was beginning to pool in the dirt beneath Carter's head. She saw only one thing, the thick, brutal arm that held Sam captive. She raised the rifle again. She centered the wavering sight on Silas's shoulder. She squeezed the trigger. The second explosion was a part of her, an extension of her will. The bullet flew true. Silas screamed, a high, sharp cry of pain and shock. The arm holding Sam went limp. The boy fell to the ground, scrambling away on his hands and knees, back toward the safety of the cabin, toward her. Silas staggered back, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. The other 2 men recovered from their shock, raising their rifles, their faces contorted with rage. Mary knew she was dead. She had fired her one desperate shot, and now she was exposed, helpless. She fumbled to work the rifle's lever, but her fingers were numb and clumsy. It was then that a 3rd explosion rocked the night. But it didn't come from her gun, or from theirs. It came from the direction of the barn. It was the deep, authoritative boom of a heavy-caliber buffalo gun. A puff of dust erupted from the ground near the feet of one of the gunmen, making him yelp and jump back. A new figure emerged from the shadows of the barn. He was an old man, his back bent with age, but he held the long, heavy rifle with the easy familiarity of a lifelong companion. It was Raoul, the old ranch hand who had come with the property, a quiet, weathered man who rarely spoke, and who Mary had assumed was half-deaf and mostly asleep in his bunkhouse behind the barn. "Get off this land." Raoul's voice was a dry, gravelly rasp, but it carried the unquestionable weight of authority. He calmly worked the lever of his rifle, seating a new round in the chamber, the sound of final, deadly promise. The two gunmen looked at each other, then at their wounded, groaning leader, and then at the two rifles now pointed at them, one in the hands of a wounded but steady old man, the other in the hands of a wild-eyed girl who had already proven she was willing to shoot. The odds had changed. This was no longer an easy prize. Without another word, they grabbed Silas, hauling him to his feet, and half-dragged, half-carried him to their horses. They mounted up and spurred their animals into the darkness, disappearing as quickly and as violently as they had arrived. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by Sam's terrified sobs as he clung to Mary's legs. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy and acrid in the cold night air. The immediate danger was gone, but the battle was far from over. Mary let the heavy rifle slip from her numb fingers, its barrel clattering against the porch. Her eyes were fixed on the dark, unmoving shape of the man who had tried to save them, lying broken and bleeding in the dirt. The world rushed back in a wave of sound and cold. The acrid smell of gunpowder burned in Mary's nostrils. Sam's terrified sobs were a frantic, desperate rhythm against her leg. In the distance, the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert night. But Mary's entire universe had collapsed to a single point, the dark, motionless figure of Carter, lying face down in the dirt of the yard. He was so still. That was the most terrifying part. Carter Holt was a man of constant, deliberate motion. Even in stillness, he possessed a coiled energy, a readiness. Now, there was nothing. He was just a shape, a heap of worn denim and leather that had lost its animating force. A dark, wet patch was spreading in the dust beneath his head. "Ma'am." The voice, dry as a riverbed in summer, startled her. Raoul stood on the porch, his ancient buffalo gun held loosely in the crook of his arm. His weathered face, a roadmap of wrinkles and sun-scoured skin, was grim in the moonlight. He looked from her, to the crying boy, and then to the man on the ground. "We need to get him inside," Raoul said. There was no panic in his voice, only the flat, practical tone of a man who had seen his share of violence and its aftermath. The old man's words were a lifeline, pulling Mary from the frozen sea of her shock. She nodded, her movements stiff and jerky. She gently unwrapped Sam's arms from her leg. "Sam, sweetie, go inside. Stay by the fire," she whispered, her voice a ragged, unfamiliar thing. The boy, his face streaked with tears and dirt, looked from her to the still form of Carter, his lower lip trembling. But he obeyed, scurrying into the relative safety of the cabin. Mary and Raoul knelt on either side of Carter. The smell of blood was strong, coppery and sickening. "Easy now," Raoul murmured as they carefully turned him over. His face was slack, his eyes closed. A deep, ugly gash ran along his scalp, matted with blood and dirt. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper, a barely there sound that was the only sign he was still alive. Getting him inside was a clumsy, desperate struggle. He was a dead weight, his lean frame far heavier than it looked. Raoul, though wiry, was old, and Mary's strength was born of adrenaline, not muscle. They half-dragged, half-carried him up the steps and into the cabin, his boots scuffing on the wooden planks. They managed to get him to his own cot, a larger, sturdier bed in the corner opposite hers. He sank into the straw mattress with a heavy finality that terrified her. "Water," Raoul said, already moving to the hearth. "Hot, if we can. And clean rags, all you can find." While the old man tended the fire, Mary tore strips from a clean linen sheet she found in a wooden chest, her hands shaking so badly she could barely guide the fabric. The next hour was a blur of frantic, focused activity. They cleaned the wound as best they could. her stomach churning at the sight. Raoul, with a surprising gentleness, held Carter's head steady while Mary carefully washed away the blood and grime. The gash was deep, the edges raw and swollen. "He's got a hard head," Raoul grunted, his attempt at reassurance doing little to quell the fear that was a cold, living thing in Mary's chest. "But this is a bad knock." They bandaged his head with the clean linen strips. Raoul brought a chair and placed it beside the cot. "You sit," he said, his gaze firm. "I'll see to the boy in the yard." He disappeared, leaving her alone with the two silent figures in the cabin, the sleeping boy and the unconscious man. And so began the vigil. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. The sun rose and set. The days bled into nights. But Mary's reality was circumscribed by the four posts of Carter's bed. She did not leave his side. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford, something she snatched in brief. Dreamless snatches in the chair, her head nodding forward until the fear of missing a breath, a twitch, a groan, would jerk her awake again. Raoul would appear at intervals, a silent wraith, leaving a plate of food she rarely touched, a fresh bucket of water, a quiet report on the state of the ranch. "Horses are fine," he would say. Chopped some more wood. His steady presence, his insistence on the continuation of ordinary life, was its own form of comfort. Carter burned with fever. His skin, usually cool and dry from the desert air, was hot to the touch. His face flushed. Mary spent hours bathing his forehead and neck with a cloth dipped in cool water, watching the faint lines of pain that were etched between his brows, willing her touch to bring him some measure of peace. His breathing remained shallow, sometimes catching in his chest with a sound that sent a fresh spike of terror through her. In the long, silent hours, she talked to him. Her voice was a low, constant murmur, a thread of sound weaving through the heavy stillness. She did not talk about the attack, or about their pursuers. She spoke of the small, simple things that made up their life in the valley. "The black hen laid another egg today. Carter," she'd whisper, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, feeling for the faint, thready pulse. "She's a good layer. Sam and I collected it. Sam misses you. He asked when you were going to wake up and tell him another story about the cactus bears." She told him about the squash in the garden, how a new one had ripened on the vine. She described the way the sunlight hit the canyon walls in the late afternoon, turning the rock the color of a blood orange. She recounted stories from her own childhood, before her mother had passed, before her father had faded into a ghost. She filled the silence with the mundane, the hopeful, the ordinary, creating a wall of words to keep the darkness at bay, to tether him to the world of the living. Sam was her other shadow. After the first day of frightened hiding, he seemed to understand that the best place to be was near Carter. He would bring a piece of charcoal and a smooth piece of kindling wood and sit on the floor beside the cot, his small head bent in concentration as he drew pictures of horses, of the cabin, of a tall cowboy with a hat. Sometimes he would look up, his bright, worried eyes meeting Mary's. "Is he still sleeping?" he would ask. "He's just resting," Mary would answer, forcing a smile that felt brittle and thin. "He's working hard at getting better." The boy would nod, satisfied with this explanation, and return to his drawing. His quiet, trusting presence was both a comfort and a terrible weight. He believed Carter would wake up. He believed Mary could fix him. His faith was an unspoken demand that she not give in to despair. For 2 days, there was no change. Carter remained lost in the deep, silent country of his injury. He was a ship becalmed, and all Mary could do was watch and wait for a breath of wind. On the third morning, as she was once again wiping his brow with a cool cloth, she saw it, a faint, barely perceptible flicker of his eyelids. Her breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Carter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Carter, can you hear me?" There was no other response, but it was something. It was the first crack in the wall of silence. Later that day, as she tried to trickle a few drops of water between his cracked lips. She felt a subtle movement in his throat, a reflexive swallow. It was another victory, a small, precious sign that the man she knew was still in there, fighting his way back. She felt a surge of hope so fierce it was painful. The fourth day was a day of slow, quiet miracles. His breathing, which had been so shallow, deepened. It found a new, steadier rhythm, the slow, even cadence of deep sleep rather than the ragged gasps of a man on the edge. In the afternoon, as she sat holding his hand, a habit she had fallen into, the feel of his large, calloused hand in hers, a tangible connection, she felt it, a faint pressure. His fingers, which had been limp and lifeless, curled weakly around hers. She let out a small, choked sob. She brought his hand to her cheek, pressing the rough knuckles against her skin, tears of relief and exhaustion finally beginning to fall. He was coming back, slowly, painstakingly. He was fighting his way back to them. The fever broke that night, when she laid her hand on his forehead. His skin was cool and damp. She stayed awake all night, watching, listening to the new strength in his breathing, feeling the occasional, reassuring pressure of his hand in hers. It happened just after dawn on the fifth day. The first rays of sun were cutting through the dusty cabin window, illuminating the small space with a soft, hopeful light. Mary had dozed off in the chair, her head slumped forward, her hand still entwined with his. A small sound, a soft groan, pulled her from the depths of her exhaustion. Her head snapped up. His eyes were open. They were not the clear, sharp, gray eyes she knew. They were clouded with confusion and pain, unfocused, staring up at the timbered ceiling. He blinked slowly, as if the mechanism were rusty from disuse. His gaze drifted around the room, taking in the familiar shapes of the fireplace, the table, the sleeping form of Sam. And then his eyes found her. They stopped. The fog of confusion seemed to recede, replaced by a slow, dawning recognition. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long, silent moment. He saw her. He saw the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, the tangled mess of her uncombed hair, the tear stains on her cheeks. He saw the fierce, unwavering devotion that had kept her chained to his side. He didn't speak. He didn't try to move. All the questions, all the thanks, all the unspoken emotions of the past 5 days were contained in that one, long, steady gaze. It was a look that acknowledged everything. And it was that look that finally broke her. The dam of her fear, her exhaustion, her tightly leashed hope burst. A great shuddering sob escaped her. And then another. The tears she had held back for days came in a hot, unstoppable flood. She didn't try to hide them. She leaned forward, burying her face in the rough blanket on his chest, still clutching his hand, and wept. She cried for the terror of the attack, for the fear of losing him, and most of all, for the overwhelming, bone-deep relief that he was back. He was alive, and he was looking at her as if she were the only thing in the world. Recovery is not a moment. It is a slow, arduous journey back to the light. Carter's return to consciousness was not an immediate restoration. It was the first, tentative step on a long road. The days that followed his awakening were a landscape of small, painful victories. The first time he managed to sit up on his own, the cabin tilting violently around him as a wave of dizziness threatened to pull him back under. Mary was there, her shoulder braced against his back, a steady, solid presence until the world settled. The first time he took a few halting steps, leaning heavily on her, his legs unsteady as a newborn colt's. Her strength was his own. He was a difficult patient only in his impatience. The active, ceaseless energy that defined him was now trapped in a body that would not obey. He would watch from his cot, his eyes following Mary as she tended the garden, fed the chickens, and managed the small ranch with a competence that both frustrated and humbled him. She had risen to the occasion, not just as a nurse, but as a custodian of their shared life. She and Raoul had repaired the broken corral fence. She had learned to milk their single, bad-tempered goat. She had kept the fragile world of the valley turning while he had been lost to the darkness. Sam, overjoyed to have Carter awake, had to learn a new kind of gentleness. His boisterous energy was tempered into a quiet companionship. He would sit for hours by the cot, not with his charcoal and wood, but with a book of letters Mary was teaching him to read, his small voice sounding out the words in a soft, careful murmur. He would bring Carter a cup of water, holding it with 2 hands to keep it from spilling, his small face a mask of solemn responsibility. He was no longer just a boy being protected. He was a boy learning to protect in return. The first day, Carter was able to stay on his feet for more than a few minutes. He walked to the cabin door. The sight of it was a raw, physical reminder of their violation. It hung crookedly on one hinge, the wood splintered and scarred where Silas's boots had struck it, a gaping wound in the skin of their home. He ran his hand over the broken planks, his expression grim. "It needs fixing," he said, his voice still rough from disuse. "We can do it," Mary replied, coming to stand beside him. She did not say, "You can do it." She said, "Way." And so, the work of mending began, a task that was as much about rebuilding their home as it was about healing its inhabitants. It was a slow, collaborative effort. At first, Carter's role was one of quiet direction, weakened by his injury, his head still prone to sudden, blinding aches. He could not do the heavy work. He would sit on a stool on the porch, a silent foreman, his sharp eyes guiding the process. "That brace needs to be trued up," he'd say, and Mary, her face smudged with sawdust, would adjust the new timber they were fitting into the frame. He showed her how to use the handsaw properly, not forcing the blade but letting its weight do the work, how to drive a nail in straight and true with 2 sharp blows instead of a dozen clumsy ones. She was a quick study, her movements becoming more confident with each passing hour. Even Sam had a role. He was the keeper of the nails, fetching them from a canvas pouch and handing them up to Mary, his face alight with the importance of his task. Raoul appeared from the barn with a pot of hot pine pitch to seal the new wood against the weather, his presence a quiet, steady reinforcement. They did not just patch the old door. They dismantled it completely, piece by broken piece. They built a new one from fresh-cut planks of juniper, the wood fragrant and strong. As they worked, side by side in the warm autumn sun, the sounds of their labor, the rasp of the saw, the rhythmic tap of the hammer became a kind of music, a song of restoration. They were erasing the scars of the attack, not by covering them up, but by building something new and stronger in their place. While the door was their main project, they also worked to heal the yard. Together, they raked away the scuffed earth where the fight had taken place, smoothing the ground until the signs of the struggle were gone. Mary found the spent shell casing from her second shot, the small piece of brass warm from the sun. She closed her hand around it for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the woman she had been forced to become in that terrifying moment. And then she threw it as far as she could into the brush. They were reclaiming their peace, one small act at a time. The first evening, the new door was hung, solid and secure in its frame. A palpable sense of relief settled over the small cabin. It felt whole again. It felt safe. That night, for the first time since the attack, they cooked their dinner together. The small space was filled with a comfortable, domestic bustle. Mary stood at the hearth, stirring a pot of savory stew that filled the air with the scent of herbs and simmering meat. Sam, chattering happily, was carefully setting the 3 tin plates on the table. Carter came in from the corral. Having managed some light work with the horses, he moved with a new sureness, the weakness of the past weeks finally beginning to recede. He went to the water bucket, filled a dipper, and brought it to the table. He set it down, and then picked up a tin cup to fill for Mary, who was still busy at the fire. He walked over to her, extending the cup. "Here," he said. She turned, a spoon in her hand, and reached for the cup. As she took it from him, her fingers brushed against his. It was a simple, accidental touch, the kind that happens a dozen times a day. But it was different. Neither of them pulled away immediately. For a long, silent moment, their hands lingered, her soft skin against his calloused knuckles. The air in the small space grew still and charged, the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of the stew the only sounds. He looked down at her, his gray eyes, clear now and free of pain, holding a depth of emotion she had never seen there before. It was a look of gratitude, of awe, of a feeling so profound it needed no words. Mary's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the warmth of his hand, the faint tremor that ran through it. In that silent, lingering touch, an entire conversation took place. It spoke of shared fear and fierce protection, of long nights of vigil and the slow dawn of recovery. It was a confirmation of the bond that had been forged between them, a bond tempered in terror and annealed in quiet care. It was Sam who broke the spell. "Carter, did you know a snake can swallow a whole chicken?" he asked, his voice filled with morbid fascination. Carter blinked, and the moment was gone. He gently released her hand, and she took the cup, but the feeling of his touch remained, a warm imprint on her skin. A slow smile touched Mary's lips as she turned back to the fire. That evening, after the meal was done and Sam was tucked onto his pallet, fast asleep, Carter and Mary stood on the porch. The new door was closed firmly behind them, a symbol of their renewed security. A sliver of a moon hung in the inky black sky, and the stars were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds. The wind was cool, carrying the clean scent of pine and distant rain. They stood side by side, not touching, but so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. They looked out over the valley, a familiar landscape of shadows and moonlight that was no longer a place of hiding, but a place of belonging. It was their home, fought for and reclaimed. Mary thought back to that first day, to the terrified girl who had begged to hide in the shadow of this man's coat. She had been so small then, so broken. She had been running from a life where she was a thing to be owned, a debt to be paid. Here, in this wild, lonely place, she had become something else entirely. She had become a partner, a protector, a healer. She was no longer a victim. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. It was a silence built of shared experience and mutual respect. But Mary knew, with a sudden, unshakable clarity, that it was time for the silence to be filled. It was time for a new truth to be spoken. She turned her head to look at him. His profile was strong and steady in the moonlight, his gaze fixed on the dark, sleeping land. "I don't want to hide under your coat anymore," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying easily in the still night air. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Waiting. She met his gaze without flinching, her heart beating a strong, steady rhythm. "I want to stand beside you," she continued, the words feeling more right, more true than anything she had ever said. She took a breath and spoke the final, binding truth. For a lifetime. It was not a question. It was a statement, a declaration of intent, a vow offered freely, born not of debt or obligation, but of a love that had grown, quiet and deep, in the hard soil of survival. She was offering him all that she was, and all that she had become. Carter stared at her, his gray eyes searching hers in the pale light. A dozen emotions played across his face: surprise, relief, a profound, heart-stopping tenderness. He did not speak. Words were not his language. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, raised his hand and gently touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. He leaned in, and for the first time, he smiled. It was not the fleeting twitch she had seen before. It was a real, slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. erasing the hard lines of pain and solitude and revealing the warm, steady heart of the man beneath. And in that smile, she had her answer. The night after her declaration was a strange and delicate country. Sleep, when it came, was thin and restless, punctuated by moments of waking in the deep, silent dark of the cabin. Each time, Mary's first thought was of the words she'd spoken on the porch, a quiet vow sent out into the vastness of the desert night. Had she been too bold? Had she misread the tenderness in his smile, the gentle pressure of his hand on her cheek? The silence that had followed her words had not been one of rejection, but it had been a silence nonetheless. And in the lonely hours before dawn, it left a space for doubt to creep in. She rose before the first light, her movements quiet so as not to wake the two sleeping males. She stoked the embers in the hearth, adding fresh kindling until a small, determined flame flickered to life. She filled the coffee pot and set it on the grate, the familiar, comforting ritual a balm to her unsettled nerves. She was just a woman, making coffee in her home. Whatever happened, that much was real. When Carter rose, the cabin was filled with the rich, dark aroma of coffee and the soft, gray light of pre-dawn. He moved with his usual economy of motion, but there was a new awareness in the space between them. When he came to the hearth to pour himself a mug, his arm brushed against hers, and this time, the touch was not accidental. It was a brief, deliberate acknowledgement, a current of silent understanding that passed between them. He did not speak, and neither did she, but the question of the previous night hung in the air, as real and tangible as the wood smoke. The morning routine unfolded as it always did. The simple, domestic rhythm was a comfort, a foundation of normalcy beneath the trembling uncertainty of the day. Mary mixed the batter for corn cakes while Carter went out to see to the horses, his boots crunching on the cold, hard-packed earth. Sam woke up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and took his usual place at the table, his small feet swinging back and forth, a picture of innocent indifference to the adult current swirling around him. When Carter came back inside, he brought with him the crisp, clean scent of the morning air. He placed a skillet on the fire, and soon the cabin was filled with the sizzle and pop of frying bacon. Mary put the plates on the table, her hands moving automatically. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to either solidify beneath her feet or crumble away into nothing. They sat down to eat. The meal was a quiet one, even for them. Sam, sensing the strange, charged atmosphere, was less talkative than usual, concentrating on chasing a piece of bacon around his plate with his fork. Carter ate with his usual deliberate slowness, his gaze fixed on his food. Mary could barely swallow. The corn cake felt like ash in her mouth. She kept her eyes downcast, studying the patterns in the grain of the wooden table, unable to meet his gaze. It was when she reached for the small tin spoon to stir a little honey into her coffee that she saw it. Resting on the rough-spun napkin beside her plate, just next to her spoon, was a ring. Her hand froze in midair. For a long moment, she simply stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. It was not a grand piece of jewelry. It was not the heavy, ornate gold band of possession that Alistair Finch had tried to put on her finger. This was something else entirely. It was a simple, unadorned band of silver, polished to a soft, dull gleam that seemed to drink in the warm lamplight. It looked as if it had been hammered into shape by hand, its surface not perfectly smooth but bearing the faint, subtle marks of its creation. It was not a ring of wealth or power. It was a ring of substance, of quiet strength, of something made to last. It was, she realized with a sudden, breath-stealing clarity, a perfect reflection of the man sitting at the head of the table. Her head snapped up, her eyes flying to his. He was watching her, his expression calm and steady. He had been waiting for her to see it. The question was there, in his clear gray eyes. A silent inquiry that was more powerful than any spoken word could ever be. Her own eyes filled with tears, blurring his face into a soft, indistinct shape. This was his answer. Not a speech, not a promise, but a simple, solid, tangible thing. An offering, a choice. He must have seen the turmoil of emotion on her face, because he finally broke the silence. His voice was low and a little rough, as if the words themselves were unfamiliar territory for him. "If you want it," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "you can have my name tomorrow morning." The words settled over her, simple and direct and utterly profound. He wasn't asking her to be his wife in the way the world understood it. He was offering her a part of himself. He was offering her his name, his identity, his protection, his home. Holt. The name felt solid and safe on her tongue, even unspoken. It was the name of the boy sleeping in the corner, the name of the man who had pulled her from the darkness. It was the name of a family. She could not speak. The lump in her throat was too large, too tight. She could only nod. A series of small, jerky movements that conveyed all the hope and fear and overwhelming gratitude that was flooding her heart. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. Carter saw it, and the corner of his mouth lifted in that rare, slow smile that was hers alone. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. A silent confirmation that the pact was sealed. The deal was struck, not with a contract or a dowry, but with a simple silver ring and a shared look across a rough-hewn table. The rest of the day passed in a dreamlike haze. They did not speak of it again. There were no plans to be made, no guests to invite, no preparations to fuss over. The decision had been made, and the event would simply happen. It would be as natural and as certain as the rising of the sun. Yet, everything felt different. Every shared glance, every time their hands brushed as they worked, was charged with a new significance. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a boy sharing a space. They were a family on the verge of being named. The next morning, Mary awoke before anyone else, in the deep velvet darkness that precedes the dawn. She did not light a lamp. She moved by feel, her heart a quiet, steady drum of anticipation. She washed her face in the cold water from the basin, the chill of it a sharp and welcome shock that grounded her in the reality of the moment. She did not have a white wedding dress. She had the clean, mended dark blue cotton dress that he had provided for her, the one she had worn every day since her arrival. She put it on, its familiar texture a comfort. She brushed her dark hair until it shone, and instead of pinning it up in its usual severe bun, she let it fall loose over her shoulders. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror that hung by the door. The face that looked back was no longer the pale, haunted face of a frightened girl. Her skin was tanned by the sun. Her eyes were clear, and there was a new, quiet strength in the set of her jaw. She stepped outside. The air was cold and still, the stars beginning to fade as the eastern horizon softened to a pale, luminous gray. She walked to the small vegetable patch and found a single, stubborn desert marigold still blooming, its bright yellow petals a splash of defiant color against the muted tones of the coming dawn. She plucked it and tucked it into her hair. It was her only adornment. It was all she needed. When she returned to the cabin, Carter was awake. He was dressed not in his heavy, protective duster, but in a clean, simple denim shirt. He was standing by the open door, watching the day being born. He turned as she entered, and his eyes took her in, from her loose hair to the simple dress to the bright flower tucked behind her ear. He did not speak, but a slow, warm look of approval spread across his face. He held out his hand. She took it, his strong fingers closing around hers. Together, they walked out onto the porch. Sam was already there, his hair still sleep-tousled. He had been told the night before that something important was happening in the morning, and his face was alight with a mixture of excitement and solemnity. He ran to them, taking both of their free hands, connecting them. Raoul was there, too, He stood a little ways off, leaning against a porch post, his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing his cleanest, though still threadbare, shirt. He offered them a gruff, formal nod, his presence a silent, steady pillar of witness. Their final guest was one of Carter's horses, a calm, steady mare named Dust Devil. Sam, in a fit of ceremonial inspiration, had tied a piece of faded red ribbon he had found to the horse's bridle. The mare stood patiently, her warm breath pluming in the cold air, a quiet, living symbol of their life in this place. There was no aisle to walk down, no altar to stand before. Their cathedral was the vast, open valley. Their stained glass window was the eastern sky, which was now exploding in breathtaking swaths of rose, gold, and pale, ethereal blue. Their music was the soft sigh of the wind through the juniper trees and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk circling high above. There was no priest, no book of scripture. Their ceremony was simply the act of standing together, a small, human constellation against the immense, silent majesty of the dawning day. Carter turned to face her, still holding her hand. With his other hand, he reached into his pocket and brought out the silver ring. It seemed to shine with a light of its own in the soft glow of the sunrise. Sam watched, his eyes wide with wonder, understanding that this was the most important part. Carter did not recite any formal vows. The vows had already been made in the darkness of a rattling boxcar, in a desperate flight across the desert, in the long, fevered nights of a vigil, and in the quiet, daily acts of mending a broken home. His vow was in his gaze as he looked at her now, a look so full of love and respect and fierce protectiveness that it made her heart ache. Slowly, reverently, he took her left hand. His thumb gently brushed the calluses on her palm, a silent acknowledgement of the work they had shared. He slid the cool, smooth silver ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He did not say, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He said something far more meaningful. He looked deep into her eyes, his thumb resting on the ring that now bound them together. And he spoke her new name aloud for the very first time, his voice a low, steady vow in the quiet of the morning. Mary Holt. The name settled over her, not as a possession, but as a gift. It was a shield, a home, a future. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes. But this time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a joy so profound, so complete, that it felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. She raised her other hand and placed it on his cheek, feeling the rough stubble of his beard, the solid warmth of his skin. She could not speak. She did not need to. Her answer was in her touch, in the brilliant, tear-filled smile that broke across her face. It was in the way she leaned into him, a silent, final surrender, not of her will, but of her solitude. In the vast, unforgiving heart of the desert, surrounded by the quiet witnesses of a small boy, an old man, a patient horse, and the rising sun, Mary Holt found the one thing she had long ago decided she was not worthy of. She was not saved from her past. She had outrun it. She was not given a new life. She had built one, with her own two hands, and she had not been rescued by a hero. She had found a partner to stand beside for a lifetime. There was no honeymoon, no journey to a new and exciting place. The journey, for Carter and Mary Holt, was the slow and steady reclamation of the life that had been so violently interrupted. Their world remained the small, hidden valley, but its dimensions had changed. It was no longer a refuge. It was a homestead. It was not a place to hide, but a place to build. The first frost arrived, a silver lacework that covered the land in the early morning and melted away by noon, leaving the air clean and sharp. The days were filled with the hard, satisfying labor of preparing for winter. The rhythm of their life was dictated by necessity and the turning of the seasons. They worked to mend the section of the barn roof that had been damaged in a summer storm. Their movements a practiced, silent ballet. Carter, his strength now fully returned, would climb the ladder, his hammer ringing out in a steady, metallic beat against the cold air. Mary would be below, sawing new planks of timber, the muscles in her arms and back now strong and sure. She would pass the wood up to him, their hands meeting for a brief moment, a small, unspoken acknowledgement of their partnership. Sam, too small for the heavy work, was given the vital task of gathering the old, bent nails into a bucket, his small face a mask of concentration as he contributed to the family's effort. Before, these tasks had been Carter's alone, a solitary battle against the relentless forces of decay. Now, they were a shared responsibility. When they mended the fences along the northern edge of the pasture, it was not Carter's fence, but our fence. When Mary went to the chicken coop in the morning, she was gathering our eggs. The small, potent word had seeped into the very soil of the valley. It was in the way Carter would now pause at the top of a rise and wait for her to catch up, not out of concern for her weakness, but simply so they could look out over their land together. It was in the way she would save him the last of the coffee, keeping it warm by the fire until he came in from the cold. The heavy cloak of his solitude, which he had worn for so long, had been gently lifted, and he had found that the air underneath was not as cold as he had imagined. The most profound shift, the one that cemented their new reality, came not from an adult, but from the child they were raising together. It happened on a chilly afternoon, as Mary was kneading a heavy lump of dough on the floured kitchen table. Sam, who had been trying to carve a piece of soft wood with a small, dull knife, let out a sharp cry of pain. "I got a splinter," he wailed, his eyes welling up with tears. Mary immediately abandoned the dough, wiping her hands on her apron as she hurried to his side. She knelt before him, taking his small, trembling hand in hers. "Let me see, sweetie," she said, her voice soft and soothing. Sam, his lower lip quivering, held out his finger. "It hurts. Ma." He sniffed, the words slipping out as naturally and as easily as a breath. The world seemed to halt for a single, suspended heartbeat. Mary froze, her fingers hovering over the boy's hand. "Ma!" The word echoed in the quiet cabin, a sound she had never expected to hear directed at her. It was the name she had cried out in her own childhood, the name of the only person who had ever made her feel completely safe. To hear it now, from this small, trusting boy who was not of her blood but was entirely of her heart, was an overwhelming, gut-wrenching gift. She looked up, her eyes seeking Carter's. He was sitting by the fire, oiling a piece of leather, and he had heard it. He had stopped his work, his hands still, and he was looking at them. There was no surprise on his face, only a deep, quiet look of rightness, of affirmation. He gave her a single, slow nod, a silent acknowledgement that this was as it should be. The last piece of their family had just clicked into place. A warm, brilliant smile broke through the tears that had gathered in Mary's eyes. She turned back to Sam, her touch infinitely tender as she examined his finger. "I know it does. Honey," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't you worry. Ma will get it out." Raoul, their silent, steadfast witness, saw the change as well. He still lived his solitary life in the small bunkhouse behind the barn, but he would often join them for their evening meal, his presence a comforting, grandfatherly fixture at their table. He had been there for the terror of the attack, and he had stood witness to the quiet, dawn-lit ceremony that had bound them together. He saw the way Mary now moved about the cabin, with the easy confidence of a woman in her own home. He saw the silver ring on her finger, a constant, quiet gleam in the firelight. He saw the way Carter's gaze would follow her, a soft, protective watchfulness that had replaced the hard, solitary vigilance he had once maintained. One evening, as he was leaving, he paused on the porch and looked back at the warm, golden light spilling from the cabin window. He saw the three of them inside, their heads bent together over one of Sam's drawings. A slow, satisfied smile creased his weathered face. He had seen many official weddings in his long life, presided over by priests with books and promises, but he knew, with the simple wisdom of old age, that he had never witnessed a union more real, more true, than the unspoken vow that held the three souls in that small cabin together. The desert wind still blew through the valley, a constant, restless presence, but it no longer carried only the scent of dust and the lonely perfume of sagebrush. Now, as it swept past the cabin, it picked up new fragrances. It carried the warm, yeasty smell of baking bread, the savory aroma of a rich vegetable soup simmering on the hearth, the faint, sweet scent of the marigolds Mary now tended in a small, protected box on the windowsill. The cabin, once just a shelter, a functional bastion against the elements, had become a home. It had a heart now, and its warmth radiated out into the harsh landscape, a small but defiant beacon of life and love. One afternoon, as the winter sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley floor, Mary stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. She was looking out at the world she now called her own. Carter came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. They stood in a comfortable, familiar silence, watching the sky bleed from blue to orange to a deep, bruised purple. She felt the cool, solid weight of the silver ring on her finger. She twisted it, a new and cherished habit. She thought of the other ring, the one of gold, the one that had been a symbol of her bondage. That ring had been taken from her, a part of a debt she had been forced to run from. This ring, this simple band of silver, could never be taken. It was not a symbol of a transaction, it was a symbol of a choice, freely made and fiercely protected. She thought of her name. For so long, her name, Mary, had been a liability, the name of a girl to be hunted, a piece of property to be reclaimed. Now, she had a new name, a name that was not a target, but a shield. It was a name that meant she belonged somewhere, that she belonged with someone. She no longer had to hide in the shadows, or under the protective cloak of a stranger. She could stand here, in the open, under the vast, uncaring sky, and feel not fear, but a profound and unshakable peace. The life she had here was not an easy one. It was a life of hard work, of constant vigilance, of knowing that the wilderness was always waiting to reclaim what it had lost. But it was a real life. It was a shared life. And it was hers. The last of the sunlight faded from the canyon rim, and the first pale stars began to appear. Carter put his arm around her, drawing her close against the evening chill. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her journey finally, truly, at its end. She had run from a cage, only to find her freedom not in the running, but in the finding of a place to stand her ground. She was no longer hiding. She was home. She was Mary Holt. Thank you so much for joining us for this Wild West story. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners just like you, please support us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.